And welcome to our, actually this might be our first night we've actually billed as International Crime, although we've been really lucky over the years to have visitors from other countries. Do we count Canada? Maybe. Yay!
All right.
And tonight we're really fortunate that we have a super group, a quartet of, or a quad. What should I say, Sulari? Which is going to be the more correct word for the four of you? Are you a quad, a pod?
Sounds way too musical for us.
Okay. A quad of authors from Australia who are identifiable by their accents, although, you know, to your untrained ear, maybe they will sound like they're British, who knows. And then we have, on my right, these two wonderful gentlemen from South Africa, and they sound South African, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And on this side, we have Tim Maleeny from New York, which kind of counts. but Tim
Almost
has...
another country.
Right, almost another country. But Tim's series actually involves a guy based in San Francisco, but his partner, named Sally, who's kind of a lethal weapon, comes from China. Hong Kong, actually. Do I need to distinguish between them in the current political environment?
I would distinguish.
You
I
need
would
to
say.
use that.
Sorry. Yes, I would say she comes from Hong Kong.
Hong Kong.
Hong Kong.
Right. So that's kind of our tenuous thread here for involving Tim. So, I have known Michael Stanley. You want to identify which one of you is which?
I'm Michael Sears. I'm the Michael half of Michael Stanley. You may have guessed that already.
And I'm Stan Trollope, the other half.
Stan Trollope translates, if he's Michael, where's the Stanley come from?
Stanley.
My first name.
Stanley Trollope.
Stan is short for Stanley.
I should have had
You
it
may have
there.
guessed
I
that.
know I should have before we started. Okay, so
And I do answer to Michael as well.
you do. And they do sign their books, one each. One is Michael, guess which one, and the other signs it Stanley, so you get that signature. How in the world did you two guys get together to write crime fiction?
Well, that's quite a long story. I know we haven't got too much time, so let me make it a quick one. Stan and I met in South Africa many years ago, and Stan was working in Minneapolis, and I came to Minneapolis on sabbatical. We're both academics in a previous life, and we didn't know each other very well, but Stan already knew something about my cooking, so he invited me to dinner, and I went over and we discovered we had all sorts of things in common. We were interested in books and music and birds and traveling in Africa, and Stan is also a pilot. So one thing led to another, and we took a trip together with Stan as pilot, and we had some other friends with us, and we had some food with us, and we had some wine with us. We had quite a lot of wine with us, probably. And we went to the Savuti area of Botswana, and there we saw a pack of hyenas, which most people think are just scavengers, but they're actually very powerful hunters, attack, pull down, and completely consume a wildebeest over a short period of time. And when we got back...
They eat the bones as well as the flesh.
No, they eat everything. Perhaps the hooves, and let's not go into too much detail. And when we got back to camp, we sat around and we worked on that wine that I mentioned, and we were saying, well, you know, this would be a really good way of getting rid of a murdered body, because after all, if the body's vanished, there's no body, there's no case. How are the police ever going to tie that one together?
Well, it's a habeas corpus moment.
Yeah.
Fabulous.
And being, you know, typical academics, we thought about this idea as a good premise for a mystery book, both of us being mystery readers. And with typical academic alacrity, we started writing 15 years later.
Did you wait till you were fully retired in order to have free time for this creative endeavor, or did you work it in at like 4 in the morning?
The answer is both, because I retired and so I had full time. And that's when I cajoled Michael to say we should start this book we've been talking about forever. And he was still working, but he managed to find time to fit it in.
Well, let's come back to Detective Kubu, and then your new book, Shoot the Bastards, which has a great story behind it.
Also has a great cover. I love their cover.
I want you to like the title.
I was going to ask them, how does that work, the back and forth between you two? Are you writing alternate chapters? Are you getting on the phone? How are you working as co-writers?
We normally write alternate words.
Hence the 15 years.
took us a long time to do.
Your next book will only take about 4.5 maybe.
No, normally we actually get together when we're discussing the basic plot, the outline, the characters that are going to be involved in the book, and very often that's when we take a trip to Botswana, because I live in South Africa, Stan lives in South Africa half time, but even when we're in the same country, we don't live in the same city. So we know we do need to get together occasionally, and certainly when we want to see location. We never write about anywhere we haven't been. And then after that, one of us will do a draft. Let's say I do the first draft. I'm in Johannesburg and Stan's in Minneapolis. This is great because, to preempt another question, this means we can actually write 24 hours a day. Because of the time. So I write the first chapter, let's say, and I feel rather pleased with it. I've discovered the meaning of the universe, and I put this into the chapter. And then it's bedtime, and I send it off to Stan and go to sleep.
And when I wake up, I have the draft. And I go through the draft. And it's actually the reverse is also happening. I've also been working on something. And when I go to bed, it goes to Michael. So when he wakes up, he has something. And that's how it is. So I go through Michael's draft. It X out a lot of it, of course. Usually the stuff he likes the most. And that's true. And vice versa. When I really like something, he X's it out, because we've fallen in love with the words, not the story.
Yeah.
And these things bounce backwards and forwards maybe 15, 20 times. So there really is a Michael Stanley who writes differently from either of us.
So it's a third voice, not yours and not Michael's, but,
Yeah.
but Detective Cuckoo in point of that.
That's exactly right.
That's really interesting. So here you are, lonely in your garret in San Francisco, writing all by yourself.
Exactly. Exactly. It makes me think I need a writing partner. So I'm going to solicit one of the Australians, since clearly there's plenty of them.
And then you could
maybe,
not
yeah,
only write
exactly.
24 hours, but on different days. That'd be really exciting.
Ahead of the South Africa. Our book's going to come out first.
It'll only take 7.5 years. I really like that. So, Cape Weathers, you're investigator, San Francisco, but why did you decide to partner him with Sally from Hong Kong?
Part of what I was doing, I think when you first start writing fiction, you're writing a story that you want to read, and you're influenced by all the writers that you loved. And in my case, that was people like Elmore Leonard and Donald Westlake. But I also love thrillers, and I love the international scope of that. And I didn't want to write another private detective who had the tropes of the genre, because there are people doing a great job with that, Lawrence Block, et cetera, et cetera. So I sort of wanted to invert all of that, and I wanted the toughest character in the book to be a 5-foot-tall woman. I wanted the detective to be more determined than perfect, not hapless so much as stubborn. The most physically intimidating character in the book is actually the most gentle, and I thought that dynamic, especially because in their case the dynamic is not romantic at all, this unlikely pairing, this almost odd couple going about, where her background, because of her childhood, which is more than a little traumatic, and she was basically raised to be a professional assassin, and his were so radically different. The way they approach situations is so different. The way they play off each other, the way they learn from each other, and the banter that could come from that, and how they deal with stressful situations, just to me kept it lively and kept it really interesting. The first book dealt a lot with her backstory, but that dynamic has continued to inform the story arcs of the characters as you go through the books.
So the first book's called Stealing the Dragon, which kind of suggests a Chinese or a Hong Kong, element. And I'm trying to remember, I've lost the name of the second one, which is
Beating the babushka. That got very
So we
unusual
have-
names.
we have a-
and then greasing the pinata, and now boxing the octopus.
it's the first one that isn't in a foreign country. We have babushka, which is Russian, and we have the pinata, which is Mexican, and we have the dragon. But the octopus rules his own world, as we will find out.
It's true. This one takes place, 90% of it takes place in and around San Francisco, which is where all the books begin. There are a couple of detours to China and the Spratly Islands out in the South China Sea, but most of it takes place in San Francisco, that's right.
And some of it underwater. Hence the octopus, right? An aquarium. So, back over to you guys. Detective Kubu, why did you decide to write about this sort of gentle giant?
Well, we didn't. We were novices in the fiction world. We'd both written a lot professionally, being professors, and we were told to write what we knew. So when we started, we in the first chapter, we're a
For a
hyena.
start, we didn't know much.
What did I say? Anyway, so the first chapter starts with a professor of ecology working with a game ranger, and those two stumble on a hyena eating a human body. Turns out that that human body quite obviously was not there accidentally. It didn't have any clothes, its teeth were broken, and so on and so forth. So Bongani, the professor, was going to be the main character. But of course, when it's murder, you have to get a policeman involved. And so we sent this detective, a guy called David Bengu, whose nickname is Kubu, which means hippopotamus in the local Setswana language. We sent him to investigate. And honestly, by the time he got to the body, he had told us that he was going to be the main character. We never planned it.
He's a wonderful character. He really is. Hippopotamus are actually dangerous, and when if you go on safari or whatever in South Africa, you will learn that the hippo is considered the most dangerous, right? Of the big five animals.
Oh, yeah. Of the animals in Africa, it's the third biggest killer of humans. Mosquitoes, humans, hippos.
I mean, the jackal looks like you should be more afraid of him, but never stand between the hippo and any place he wants to go. And they're surprisingly fast, too, on land, right? So you wrote, how many is it, 5 before? I'm losing count here.
We have 6 published.
Right.
And then
So Facets of Death
will be number
7. And in Facets of Death, the book coming out in January, it's a prequel, so you get to learn a lot about Kubu, but it's more fun to read it if you've read the first 6, because then there's wonderful stuff that has come along.
It was fun for us to find out about the young Kubu too.
Yes.
And we sort of felt there was this gap because, as Stan explained, we didn't plan Kubu, we didn't plan that he was going to be the main character, so we didn't do what I learned at Auchicon is called a character Bible for him. It's the first time I'd heard that, but that has all the details of the character, his background, and how he got there, and so on. And there are hints about a bit of that in the previous series, from the first book up to the 6th one, but there are no details about how he actually became the star detective at the Habarani Criminal Investigation Department. So that's what we did in Facets of Death. We took the day on which he arrives at the CID, and pretty soon he's moving faster than he can run, which is not that fast.
Right, and he's a happily married man, but you get to find out about all that too. However, that's the January book, so in a minute we're going to come back and talk about the actual book we have with us tonight, which is not, in fact, Detective Kubu.
I have a quick question about the prequel. How many years relative to the first book that you wrote is the time shift when you go back to his doing that? So the first book is how old is he? How experienced is he at that point?
Well, as we say, nothing was really planned, but more or less, our first book is set around 2008. That's when it came out, so why not?
Why not?
And so the prequel is 10 years before that.
Are you aging him in real time?
Yes.
Okay. We'll talk about that later, because
He's
sometimes they
younger.
age right out of the police department. If you
Yeah,
want to talk to
that's-
Michael Conley or Ian Rankin, it's not necessarily your best decision.
He's younger than we are, so we're not too worried about him retiring before we do.
So you all want to go out together, so to speak? Okay. All right, so back over here to you. You're actually in the advertising profession,
Yes, indeed.
which
Yes.
is a great mystery tradition. Dorothy Sayers was in advertising. Clive Cussler, whose book we are going to launch tomorrow night, was in advertising. Any of you know the jingle, Ajax, the foaming cleanser, floods the dirt? That was Clive. Every time I see him, I think about that, right? So it's Not that he's dirty or anything. I just like it too. But it's advertising.
Dorothy, you know, James Patterson. You spend enough time in advertising, eventually you want to kill somebody.
Mad men.
Yeah,
really
yeah, truly mad, angry. Yeah, usually in a meeting, and you're just thinking, I would love to just beat that guy to death with a chair, and you can't obviously do that. So yeah, this was a wonderful way to sort of, you know, on airplanes and in between. And I grew up reading crime fiction. I grew up, both my parents were readers. They had bookshelves like this. First thing my dad and I did every time we moved was build new bookshelves in the house. And I was surrounded by the wonderful pulp covers from the 30s and 40s. And yeah, I always thought about writing, but both my parents had a science background, so I had in my head, you should have a trade. So I studied chemistry, I studied physics, I studied astrophysics, went through college jumping around these different subjects, not knowing what I really wanted to do, and somehow stumbled my way into advertising, which has a fair amount of creativity and writing in it, and met a lot of people who themselves were artists and writers and everything else, and a voice in my head said, just start writing stories, just if you want to do this, just do this. And I came to novels from short stories, actually. I started writing mystery short stories, and the first one was kind of inspired by my parents, although they had a incredible marriage their entire lives, married 50 years. In the story, this couple that's been married almost 60 years can finish each other's sentences, have decided that they just can't stand each other, and they don't believe in divorce, so every year on their anniversary they make each other dinner, and they, on either side of the table, every dish except one is poison. They're basically spending the last 20 years trying to poison each other. I thought it was a love story. And that won the Macavity and became the title story for an anthology edited by Ron Coben. And from that, I got the confidence to finish a novel, which became Stealing the Dragon. So that's how I came into writing mystery novels.
I should mention, although we're going to go back to Cape and Sally, that Tim wrote one really fabulous standalone book called Jump, in which a body comes off a roof and is impaled upon the upright. Are they dolphins?
They're penguins. They're penguins, actually.
Penguin beak in the town. There it is.
You can go to San Francisco. The statue actually exists. It's a beautifully carved marble statue of a mother penguin and two baby penguins, and her beak is pointing straight up, and it's very close to a tower there. And
so in structure, it's really an Agatha Christie story in terms of, you know, everybody that's involved in the murder has to live in the apartment house because only somebody there could have gone out with the crime. But and that was the book where Tim and I came together because you had published your first two books elsewhere.
That's right. Yeah, I moved over with Jump, and yeah, Jump. I think my favorite review of Jump said it was Warren Leonard sketch shorty combined with Murder on the Orient Express as edited by Monty Python. Barbara and I started talking about the series and moving the series over, and the next one at the time was Greasing the Piñata, the one that takes place in Mexico. But yeah, Jump was great fun because it opened things up for me as a writer because it has 10 different interlocking points of view, and the end of each chapter leads into the beginning of the next, much like a jump cut in a movie. And that changed the way I wrote, and it made the chapters very short, and the books tend to be very dialogue driven, and that exercise of writing standalone was really interesting as a writer.
So
I wanted to, sorry, go ahead.
The penguin beak. When you walked past this statue and you saw this, did you immediately think this would be perfect to impale a body on?
It wasn't.
Never traveling with you. It's too scary.
No, I love these guys. I have a feeling that we have a lot in common.
Yes.
It wasn't as graphic as watching hyena, devour a wildebeest. But so a couple of weeks ago, when Boxing the Octopus came out, I did a book signing in New York, and my youngest daughter is 14, and she hadn't gone to a lot of signings before, whereas her older sister had. And at this signing, she suddenly realized the way her dad's brain works, because in my second book, there's a scene at the San Francisco Zoo where I used to take my daughters all the time, and they had those wonderful covered slides, the tube slides that you go down. And there's a scene in that book where they discover a body that's been stuffed into one of those slides. And that came up in the Q&A in the discussion, and her eyes got as big as saucers. Like, Dad, I used to be on the swings there. You sick bastard. Trying try to discourage cursing at home. But anyway, yeah, I lived right near there, right near the plaza, and that tower was there. And yeah, I have a tendency to look at innocuous things.
What sort of penguin was it?
I don't know the precise type of penguin. Yeah, I don't know. It was I think I would guess Antarctica from the contours, but it was a bit stylized. But yeah, it just had it looked more like a weapon to me than like.
By the way, did you notice
sign
at
of
the
mother's
Hyatt at Balchicon that there was a section at the end where there was quite a low railing, and then from there it was open all the way down to the ground?
The Hyatts are great places to kill people.
Yeah.
Right? The Hyatts, if you ever, if you go to
Best
Hyatt
chain for
Regency, it's a
killing
great
someone.
place for someone to like test gravity. No question about it. They love the atrium. They absolutely love the atrium.
So this is an all-animal evening. We're going to go from the hyena to the penguin and back to the octopus. But in this new book, Shoot the Bastards, we're actually going to be talking about poaching and trying to prevent animals from being harmed. So what inspired you two to write Shoot the Bastards? But before I ask you that question, let me ask you what the British title was and how we got to this title.
The British title, which came out first, is called Dead of Night. And when we came over to Poison Pen, Barbara and others had a fairly strong reaction that it wasn't strong enough for the content of the book. And so we tried all sorts of things and didn't find anything we really liked. And eventually we said to Barbara and the others, when poachers are caught in South Africa, what you hear is shoot the bastards. Actually, you hear shoot the bastards. But, and so we passed that on, and we weren't entirely certain whether you would pick it up.
Loved it.
And it did. And that caused some kerfuffle in Britain because our English editor, publisher didn't like it at all. And it turns out that the word bastard is a much stronger word in England than it is here.
Yes, they were really offended. She loosed a version of a Twitter storm,
Oh, yeah.
taking her model from
I
guess
remember.
who. But in the process, I gathered that some of the British critics and all revisited the book to see what all the controversy
Yeah.
was about.
I think everybody who follows you and everybody who follows her had their say in the matter, and fortunately, when the book came out in the UK, most of the people in the blog tour who'd written reviews of the book and so on really liked it, and so they would make comments like, "This is a really brilliant book. How could they have used such a bad title?" And we're saying, "Yes, yeah, we're happy. Carry on, more."
So what we have is a young lady who's Vietnamese American who loses a colleague. Well, she doesn't, but she has a colleague that goes lost for National Geographic, actually, a colleague there in South Africa, and decides that her mission will be to go there and see if she can find him. But she's on assignment, so to speak, from National Geographic, right? Thus neatly solving the problem of how she could afford to go off on this quixotic mission.
Exactly. And also how she can understand when Vietnamese people talk.
Yes, because it turns out that elephant poaching has a really significant connection to Vietnam, where it's considered.
Rhino.
I'm sorry, rhino
Yeah.
poaching, right. It's considered to be what?
Well, it's considered to be medicinal. We think that the big spike in demand may have come from a Taiwanese cabinet minister who proclaimed about 10 or 12 years ago that he had been cured of his cancer by ingesting rhino horn. It's also used as an aphrodisiac. We actually think that's probably buffalo horn that's powdered and laced with Viagra.
That makes more sense.
Still, the rhino gets a bum rap, so to speak,
Yeah.
right.
We started on this, I think, for a number of different reasons. One of which was that we were very upset about what was happening with the rhino poaching, and I was involved in a little group that did some mathematical modeling to try and see what would happen, for example, if you legalize the trade, because there's a huge stockpiles of rhino horn that could flood the market, and so on and so forth. But all of these things lead to basically the rhino's extinction in due course. So we were angry when we started writing the book. But we also felt we needed to take a step back from the Kubu series just for a book. We certainly love Kubu and we'll be carrying on with him. but we thought, well, it's time to just take a bit of a break so that we can refresh that as well. And so we came up with the idea of writing the standalone around the rhino poaching, and we wanted to challenge ourselves. So we decided to write a book about a female protagonist, a female Vietnamese protagonist, that we were going to do it in the first person, that we were going to do it in the first person present. I don't know what we were thinking of actually. What we'd been
It
smoking.
was something to do with the wine, I think.
I really well it had something to do with the wine. So that's where we started off, and for that reason I think it took us quite a while, and with quite a lot of help from editors. We eventually ended up with a book that does have a female Vietnamese protagonist, but is written in third person, past.
We also wanted to move away from a police procedural set in Botswana, which is the Kubu series, and have a protagonist who's outside the environment in which she finds herself. So she's from Minnesota and finds herself a relatively young, naive investigative reporter in the middle of the really horrible rhino wars in South Africa, not knowing who to trust and working with people whose trust can change very rapidly depending on the money. And it's important to understand that the backstory is predicated on the fact that a mature rhino horn has a street value of between $400,000 and $500,000. It's much more valuable ounce for ounce than gold.
And there are lots of ethical challenges. We won't go into them because they'd be plot spoilers, but she's not free from them, and neither is virtually anybody that she deals with in the book. So it isn't a clear path to justice, as lots of mysteries are. It's much more of a thriller. And there's some possibility that you might want to pursue another book with her, right? I could just see the fire in your eye when I say that.
That's a yes. You gotta
Yes,
say
so
that.
definitely yes. All right.
Stan, you were telling me, what's the number of rhinos?
There are 25,000 rhinos in the world, more or less, most of which are in South Africa, and each year they lose between 800 and 1,000.
You know, they tried sawing off the horn and all sorts of things. When Rob and I were in South Africa over in Kruger, the guides will help each other, but if they find rhinos, they have to go to radio silence in order not to, give away. So we did stumble on some, but it's just an accident if you do. Let's talk about Oscar. Oscar's not free from.
No, Oscar.
He's actually fabulous.
Oscar is a giant Pacific octopus, and if you go to San Francisco, there's a location called Pier 39, and it's a built-out pier along the Embarcadero, and if you walk along the pier, you can, at the end of it, you're directly across from Alcatraz. If you are walking onto the pier and your left, follow the sounds of the seagulls, follow the smell, you will see an open marina, and there's sea lions, and the sea lions congregate there and sleep there. And both those things, the view and the sea lions, attract hordes of tourists. And what they've done is built out this pier into the biggest tourist trap in the world. So every chain restaurant, every souvenir shop, every tchotchke store you can possibly imagine is all squeezed onto this one pier. And it's deceptively large. And I had always written about San Francisco and kind of the seedier side of the city, and a lot of the underworld connections that go in a postcard city often out of sight, that are hiding in plain sight. And what was fascinating about this area is the sheer convergence of people from all over the world, all the different languages, all the different cultures that come there, and the sheer volume of money, including cash, that moves through that. And as I was thinking about where the next book was going to take place and moving around the city, there are these roads that have been built onto the pier. The pier is that large that can support vehicles. They go around the back of the pier, and that's where the armored trucks go to pick up the cash from the different businesses.
Cash business.
Yeah, it's
right.
largely a cash business. So I thought, okay, how would you take down an armored car in broad daylight in the middle of tourist season here? And that's how I started thinking about the premise for the book. And the biggest establishment on the pier is the aquarium by the bay, this huge aquarium. And in that aquarium, they have a giant Pacific octopus. They have actually 3. And these are creatures that can grow to 18 feet in diameter. They can squeeze into something smaller than a volleyball. in terms of the size. They have 3 hearts, they have 9 brains, they have blue blood. Some people think they're as intelligent as humans, just a completely almost alien life form. And I thought, okay, first I want to take down their armored truck, but then where's all that cash going and where's it coming from? And what if this pier wasn't what it appeared to be, but was really the basis for a very big money laundering operation tied to a much bigger conspiracy that had ties to everything from illegal drug testing, global conspiracies around pharmaceutical companies, ties to China, and it just kept extrapolating into one conspiracy after another. But the heart of it is this aquarium and our friend Oscar, and by the end of the book I realized I had to write a few chapters from Oscar's point of view, and that was more than a little fun.
It's absolutely wonderful. Justice is achieved in many forms, and Oscar had his own. He's just great. Tim writes what I would call a caper. It sounds like a private investigator story, and it is, but any of you recognize the work of Donald Westlake or Elmore Leonard or the late Ross Thomas at all. They are funny, they are fast-moving, and they are usually the heart of the question of the story is who will get away with what, as opposed to who will get punished or who did it or something. And so you think of the movie The Sting, it's a real classic of the caper. You know, there's usually a heist involved or something is stolen and all kinds of people want part of the action, and then you have to find a resolution. And I have to say that Oscar is a really inspired resolution.
Yeah, it was interesting. I knew the octopus in the title and the physical octopus, Oscar. There are 8 interlocking points of view in the narrative of this book. But like most good capers, most of the characters are morally ambiguous, if not outright villainous, and they tend to have a common goal but competing agendas. And at the beginning of the book, without giving away too much, the armored car goes off the pier, sinks into the bottom of the bay. When they recover it, the drivers are gone, the cash is gone. And as you would expect in a situation like that, there are double crosses and people who did one thing when they said they were going to do another. So things tend to go sideways and then sideways again. And to me, one of the things that's great about mysteries and crime fiction is how do ordinary people, whether they be good, bad, or somewhere in between, like most human beings, react in extraordinary situations. And as you ratchet up the pressure, what are people going to do, what alliances are going to change, and what relationships will develop in that, because there are relationships in the story as well. And that's part of the fun of it. And much like Elmore Leonard or Donald Westlake, I kind of go with the premise that most criminals are not rocket scientists, and most people act out of their own self-interest, especially under pressure, and that's where things can go horribly wrong. And the plot is propelled less by some master planning and more by one misstep after another, or one betrayal followed by another.
And we've left out the Chinese doctor who actually starts the story off, and we're in the Spratly Islands briefly.
Yeah, we are. We're in the
man-made
island.
There really is an international theme
Yes.
here. And the Chinese doctor who eventually arrives in San Francisco. It's great. But everything you said about how it works in character development applies to Oscar, the octopus. I just love the way he comes out. It's just so much fun. You will really enjoy the book. So I think at this point we're halfway through, and I know you can only sit in your chairs for about an hour before butt fatigue will kill you. So what we're going to do is
It's a horrible
we're going
death. It's worse than
Yes,
death.
it's true.
Hyenas are bad, but
That's true. So we're going to turn the microphones over to our guests from Australia at this point, and you guys become part of the audience.
All right.
All right. So we'll have a chance to answer questions for all of them at some point. Right. So if you want to just give your microphone to somebody, that would be outstanding. Here we go. Now, are you guys able to mastermind this on your own, or do you want me to do it from the front? All right. You are? One more. You're on. One of them has a loose bottom, so be careful. But it's like
we've all got loose bottoms. Oh, I've got the loose bottom. Because I'm hungry.
You're okay. It should still be green.
Is it green? I'm good.
Yeah.
Hi.
So who's starting? Sulari.
Captain?
Captain, my captain. Smallest but mightiest. Right.
Yes. Thank you, Gilligan. Well, that's Skipper, isn't it?
Professor.
Hello. Thank you for coming out to see us. We realise most of you have no idea who we are because we're new to America. physically at least. And we're very pleased to be here. So, I'll just introduce my colleagues. I'm Sulari Gentill. I write the Roland Sinclair series. I'm with Poison Pen, and Barbara's my editor. And I think you all have Crossing the Lines.
Which is not a Rollins.
Which is not a Roland Sinclair. To my right is Jock Serong. And I'll let Jock tell you
Who I am.
who you are.
Hi.
Everyone.
I've just finished my 5th novel. The one that's currently out, my 4th novel is called Preservation, which is a historical story, a true story about a shipwreck in Bass Strait, just south of Australia. Prior to that, I started out with a conventional crime novel called Quota, murder in a small fishing town and the consequences of it. And then I've sort of drifted in and out of what we all might consider crime novels or political novels. I wrote a story called The Rules of Backyard Cricket, which for American ears is not necessarily about cricket. It's about athletes and the ways that they get away with things that society lets them get away with. And then a book called On the Java Ridge, which was all about asylum seekers in boats trying to reach Australia. We kind of lead the world in being cruel to asylum seekers. So I wanted to examine that in fiction. So those are the 4 books that I have out. In a previous life, I was a trial lawyer, like Barbara is, or was, and now I'm a full-time writer. And I guess the bridge between the 2 things for me was writing about surfing. I've written for surfing magazines for about 10 years. So obviously, yeah. So there you go, that's me.
Okay.
So my name's Emma Viskic. I'm not a lawyer or a surfer. I'm so sorry. In my previous life, for my sins, I was a classical musician, and I thought that was a really hard life, so I decided to become a that's actually not true at all. I've always written and I've always played music, and along the way I've drifted in and out of both of them, and then got really serious about writing about probably 15 years ago. And as I said, I've always written, but when I decided to get serious about it, I thought instead of writing short stories or the little novellas I'd written through my childhood, I'd write a book. I wanted to sit down and write a book. And I did. I wrote a full draft of a book. It took me about a year, and I just thought it was awesome. I thought it was so good. I thought I was just amazing. And I sat down and read it. It was so boring. And I know it really was. It's I've got burn upon my death in my will. I can't quite bring myself to throw it out. But the one thing that there were 2 things that really worked with it. One was that the characters were starting to work. I'm really fascinated by people, and this is why I write. I really want to understand why people do the things they do, and why sometimes they don't do the things maybe they should do. And the other thing that worked in it was this magical thing which I had almost neglected, but just put a tiny bit in, and it's a technical term called plot. And when I realised that the plot or the story was working a little bit, I thought, well, what I probably should do is write a crime novel, because I love reading crime novels. I grew up on Sarah Peretsky and Sue Graft and even Enid Blyton, all those famous 5 stories and everything. So then I got really serious about writing a crime novel, and it came together in a book called Resurrection Bay. And Resurrection Bay, I write very much by instinct, and I started off with a single scene, which was a man holding a body in a suburban kitchen. And then everything came from there. What had happened, who was this character? And it turned out that this character's name was Caleb Zellick, and he was profoundly deaf. And from there, I went on, and 5 years later, I finished the book, which is not quite 14 years that we were hearing earlier, but it was a fair few days of my life.
What Emma won't tell you is that the book caused a clean sweep of awards in Australia. Did exceptionally well, and in fact a trifecta that I think has never happened before or since.
No, because I killed everybody. Yeah, I won through the Sisters in Crime awards and then the Nick Kelly. And they very conveniently did it on the same weekend. So thank you, Jock. I'll pay you later.
Robert.
My name is Robert Gott. I know that's an unusual surname. It sounds German. It actually means God in German. Please stay seated. However, it's actually an Anglo-Saxon occupational name, and it means a digger of ditches. So, I was one of those people. I beg your pardon?
Seems much more appropriate.
Yeah. I was one of those people who wanted to have written a crime novel rather than to write a crime novel. But that's the wrong way around. So I didn't quite know what to do. I didn't want to write a modern crime novel because you have to know so much now, because everyone watches CSI, and if you get something wrong, you get letters from people telling you that, you know, the sheep blowfly arrives 2 days after the common people, and they're not reading any more of your work. So I grew up, Australia has, it's about the same geographical size as the United States. I don't know if it's slightly larger or slightly smaller.
No, it fits in nicely.
Fits in nicely. And I grew up in a state called Queensland, which is up in the north of Australia. It's kind of a tropical and subtropical state. And in the small country town where I grew up, everyone in that town knows the story of something that happened in 1942. The town's called Maryborough. So that was during World War II. And in 1942, a young woman, aged 21, went missing. And she was missing for 2 or 3 weeks, and then her body was found dissolving in the town's water supply, which means that everyone in Maryborough was drinking her and brushing their teeth with her and washing their hair with her and washing their clothes with her, and this included my parents, which made my parents cannibals, which I thought was completely fabulous. So I had the time. The 1940s was perfect because it's that period in history that is sufficiently remote just to create a sense of nostalgia, but sufficiently close not to be alien, to be somehow familiar. So the 1940s in Australia are a very, very interesting time. And then I needed a character, so I chose someone I decided I needed someone who was not very bright, who was egomaniacal, self-centered, vain, not observant at all.
Sounds like somebody else would.
So I chose an actor.
That's not what you were thinking, was it?
Well, actually, that's something my mother said when she read the manuscript. She said, "It's all very nice, darling, but you don't think it's a little bit autobiographical, do you?"
That wasn't what I was thinking.
Yeah, sometimes mothers can be a big disappointment. So where was I? Yes, the 1940s. It was a really interesting time to write in Australia, and I loved the research for it. And I'm still doing it. All of my books are set in the 1940s in Australia.
Now, since we are all recounting origin stories, mine is a meld between all of these. Like Jock, I was a lawyer, but I was corporate, and I was quite happy being a corporate lawyer. It's one of those professions where people think you're clever, and so I was always the first person to be invited on to a Trivial Pursuit table. It's well remunerated. I was carrying on quite happily, but I was a serial hobbyist. I was one of these people who pick up a hobby, do it madly for 6 months, master it, move on to the next hobby. So I've quilted, I've painted, I've done stained glass windows, I welded, I can even pregnancy test your cows. That's a hobby? It's one of those things. I was out with a farmer one day. I thought, well, you know, and
She lives in a country town. There's nothing much to do. Very small town.
And it's really, you know, the farmer who was teaching me how to do it, he was a big man. He was a big Australian stockman. And he had these great big long arms, so it was fine.
Those.
Yeah, well, he'd go into the elbow. I had to virtually climb into the to touch anything. But aside
Let's
from
move on.
It's like a hyena.
I'm never shaking hands
So,
with you again.
I had wear gloves. I started writing just purely as a hobby, just for no other reason than I'd finished the welding course and I needed something to occupy my mind so that I didn't have to think about being a lawyer all the time.
Or a welder.
Mostly a lawyer. And so I started writing in Greek mythology, to be honest. But what I realized very quickly is that writing can be quite isolating. Not necessarily for the writer, because we have people in our heads to talk to, but it's awkward for the people who are around us. Because, essentially they're living with someone who's absent. And I'm married, I have a husband, and he found himself living with someone who was absent most of the time. He didn't complain. He dutifully went through my manuscripts. He's always my first editor, so he would check through them. But I remember one day he handed a manuscript back to me, and it was one of my Greek mythic stories, and it was full of names like Scamandrios and Achilles, etc. And he gave it back to me, and he said, "Yes, this is all very well, but can't you write something with names like Peter and Paul in it?" He's from the country, and he would stumble every time he came across the complicated Greek name. And I ignored him, as you do. But I had come to realise that this problem of being a writer, making a real world work with the imaginary world. And so I actually actively looked for a book that I thought I could write that might interest him. And Michael's an historian. His particular area of expertise is the extreme political movements of Australia and beyond in the 1930s. So essentially I grabbed his thesis and I found a novel in it. And by that, and in that way I ensured that he would continue to be interested in my work, and he would continue to edit for me. And he does that because I tell everybody that he edits for me. So any failure of history will be taken right back to him. So that's how I ended up writing the Roland Sinclair mysteries. It's a particularly pragmatic approach to writing, finding a way to keep my captive editor captive.
There are 10 of them now, aren't there?
10 editors. 10 husbands.
No. 10 novels. Keep up, Sulari. 10 novels.
There are 10 novels.
And how are you aging Roland Sinclair?
Slower than I am. So he's the initial idea was to write one book for each year between 1932 and 1945. And at book 10 I've just hit 1936 because there was a lot going on in the 30s. So, I mean, you have a similar issue with Will, don't you?
Yeah, well, with both series. I wrote a comic series and a dark series, but they're both set in the 1940s because I'm so lazy. I can't be bothered. I've already done the research. So there's a comic series and there's a dark series. And they're set at basically the same time, but the characters can't, at writers' festivals you say there's a comic world and there's a dark world, and they can never cross over. But it's just laziness. But my books move ahead a week. Each book only takes, it's in a 2-week period, and I'm up to 1944. So stay away from that.
Well, run fast, Mr. Gott, run fast.
For the first time, it's actually occurred to me that we all do a lot of research for our novels in very.
Well, my husband does a lot of research for my novels.
Okay, apart from Sulari, we all work really hard. I really want to know now, but we could talk about this at home if you like, but now I really want to know how you all go about researching and how, whether the story comes first or the research comes first, or whether you do it concurrently.
Well, in my case, Preservation is a true story about a shipwreck that happened in 1797, and are Americans prone to leaving Hawaii off maps of America? Does it happen, or is it always included? Because Australians tend to leave Tasmania off our map, and the Tasmanians get very cross. In between the great landmass of Australia and the little landmass of Tasmania, there's this tiny little group of islands called the Furneaux Group. And in the Furneaux Group, a ship was lost in 1797. It was on its way from India to Sydney, and at that stage, we had 60,000 years of Aboriginal history, but only 9 years of the English. And there was only Sydney. There was no Melbourne, there was no Hobart, there was nothing else. And the survivors of this shipwreck wound up on this rock. So there were, I think 49 people survived. And in order to get to Sydney, they figured out that Calcutta didn't know they didn't make it to Sydney. Sydney never knew they were coming in the first place, and they had sailed off the map, so they had completely vanished, and the only way they were ever going to get to help was if they organised their own rescue. So they put 17 men in this little boat, it's called the longboat, and they sailed towards Sydney. They sank the longboat after a couple of days, and now they're walking. So they had to walk something like 700 kilometres, what's that, 500 miles? Thank you, Proclaimers. From Victoria in the south of the continent all the way up to Sydney. And only 3 of them got there, which is why there's already a great hook for a novel in that. One of the 3 people who got there kept a diary, and he took off very, very quickly back to India with the diary. And it later appeared in the newspaper. And you can still look the diary up in full text on the internet, which is what I've done. And the minute you read it, you think, this thing's full of holes. This is ridiculous. He doesn't mention how 14 of them died. He doesn't mention what went wrong with the boat. He doesn't mention a whole lot of things, like how he was speared through both hands, which is a particularly strange way to be speared. So I was intrigued by this document, and it was my central artefact to research off. The other one was that the shipwreck's been found. It's in very shallow water, so you can actually swim over it.
So were you in essence cross-examining that document?
Yeah, I think that's right. And also trying to write into the gaps. As far as humanly possible, I wanted to leave the diary standing and leave all of the things we know standing, like pillars, and to just write into those little gaps in between them. So for me, it was sort of fortunate. I'm not a professional researcher, and there's a lot of technique I don't have, but I had this wonderful document that sort of teases away at you, and I had what we know from the shipwreck, which is the bottles and the clothes and all the things that turn up off the seafloor.
It's interesting what you say about writing into the gaps, because for historical fiction writers, that's the goal. It's the gap in history. So I know, because my husband's an historian, he's actually looking for facts, and when he talks about history, he talks in terms of what is known, and what my ears are pricking up for are the bits that are not known. You know, we know we were at point A, we know we were at point B, we're just not quite sure how we got there, and it's into those gaps that we make stuff up. And so, you know, it's really gold.
But you can't, if you're writing historical fiction, you can't really mess with facts, can you?
No, you
Because
can't
there is
mess
a
with
contract with the reader that he or she will come away from that book with some sense that it
Yeah, and
is.
readers get angry if you mess with facts.
Yeah.
Not to mention my husband would also get very angry if I mess with the facts.
You have an obligation, I think, no matter how you choose to treat the truth, you have an obligation to make that clear to the reader.
Yeah.
I think the reader feels swindled if they get the sense that you didn't do what you promised to do.
Yeah, well, I mean, what we're selling is a plausible reality. It's not what actually happened, but it could have happened this way. So it's why we test history. And you know, I'm lucky in that I have an expert in the era in the bed next to me, and I often say to people, it's so much more effective to talk to an historian than to actually just read, because you can argue with them, and it's probably the kind of thing you do in your head. You argue the case. I actually have a person to talk back to.
There's a thing in Australia called Trove. I don't know what the equivalent is in America.
Newspapers.com.
It's newspapers.com.
Newspapers.com.
The National Library of Australia has digitised every single newspaper published from settlement, or as close to settlement as possible, which is, when was the first newspaper, say, 1803, to the present day, and it's free. And there are tens of thousands of them, because Australia is a very big place and there are lots of towns. It's just a brilliant way of finding out what people thought. Simple things like what they were wearing, what they were eating, what they were going to the cinema to see in the 1940s. It's just a gift.
And it's all online.
And it's all online.
And
it's free.
Newspapers.com exists here, but you have to pay an arm and a leg for it. So I think you can get a trial subscription to newspapers.com for a month. So when I wrote my latest Roland Sinclair novel, which is set in America, I used that trial, and I just had to write fast to get it all done in a month. But Emma writes a contemporary novel, but her research was even more interesting.
Well, it's with living people, I guess you could say, because I I write a deaf character, as I said, and I didn't mean to. It's one of those things. I think, like a lot of writers, I start off with a feeling or an idea, and I write my way into the story. And as I write my way into the story, I then work out what it's about, and that's very much what happened with Caleb. I started writing his character, and quite early on in the piece, I wasn't quite sure why his character was doing the things that he was doing, and I wasn't quite sure who he was, but he seemed extremely determined. And as I started going, I started recognising some people I knew. One of them was a girl I'd gone to school with who was profoundly deaf. And I met her when I was about 8, 9, 10. About that age when you start really realising that other people have different lives from you, and that they think differently, and that they've got different families. And she really stayed with me, and all through my childhood I've got books and novellas and short stories written about someone who was blind, and someone who was invisible, and someone who was mute. It's actually only very recently that I've also realised that probably the main inspiration for Caleb's character was not this girl who I'd gone to school with, but actually my grandparents, who were hearing but were Croatian immigrants who didn't speak English. And as was very normal for the time in Australia, I was not raised to speak Croatian. So we had no communication whatsoever. And they're also were my only grandparents. I didn't have grandparents on my mother's side. So this lack of communication, I think, has always been there, and it had just coalesced into this one character. So once I realised I had a deaf character, and that was going to be a fantastic book as a private investigator, I promptly put the manuscript away for 6 months. Because it just seemed too hard. It seemed hard because you've got responsibilities when you write outside your own experiences, and it just seemed technically too hard.
Did you have any contact with the deaf community?
Once I started writing, absolutely, yeah. So once I realised, once I couldn't let the story go, and actually the character wouldn't let me go, I went, okay, now I have to get serious with the research. And research sounds like a really cold term. What it involved was a lot of reading to begin with, and then I learnt Australian Sign Language. I did a short course, decided I loved it.
Teaching us to swear in
I have not.
We can all swear in Auslan now.
But Emma, it's an important thing, isn't it, that we have a separate sign language in Australia?
We do, yes. Ours is based on British Sign Language, and yours is, I'm sorry guys, based on French Sign Language. And they are completely different languages. We do borrow a lot of signs in Australia from ASL, but yeah, they're very different sign languages. Yeah, so I learnt sign language absolutely fluently for like a 3 or 4 year old, if they can swear. And I did a lot of things, like I wandered around with earbuds in my ears, practicing lip reading. I did an online lip reading course, ordering really unintentionally bad coffees in cafes and things like that, and just talking to a lot of deaf and hard of hearing people. So it was fascinating. But the great thing was I didn't have to learn a single date, and I didn't have to use Trove. So I'm really happy with
I
it.
love though, Emma, about the way that you use Caleb as an investigator. There's all of those tropes that you see in crime novels, where, for instance, the detective busts into the house and you know there's something bad in that house and something bad is going to happen. Caleb does things like he gets down low and puts his hand on the floor and feels for vibration. So all of the usual things are changed radically by the fact that he's deaf.
Yeah, one of the things that was really interesting is when I started writing, all the things that I thought were going to be hard were less hard, and all the things I hadn't imagined were really fantastic. It made dialogue more important because he has to concentrate, and it really ups the tension. He doesn't know if there's someone behind him. And if he thinks there is someone in a dark room, he does have to feel for vibrations. So yeah, I think it ended up being a real plus